All right. So, something I noticed while we were prepping for our chat today, it's this UK property income allowance thing,
Hmm?
like a tax break just for rental income.
Right.
Color me intrigued.
Yeah.
But knowing how this stuff usually works, I'm guessing there's some fine print involved.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not as easy as just get money, pay less tax, unfortunately.
Right.
And that's where the HMRC's Property Income Manual comes in handy. We're going to break it down, figure out if this allowance is your golden ticket, to potentially lower those taxes.
All right. Let's do this. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty, what even is this property income allowance?
Okay.
What makes it different from all those other tax deductions landlords can usually claim?
Awesome question to get us started. So basically, the Property Income Allowance, it was introduced back in April 2017,
Mm-hmm.
and it acts as an optional tax break, specifically for individuals,
Yeah.
right, who are earning income from property.
Okay.
So instead of going the traditional route, the standard method of deducting, all those allowable expenses from your rental income,
Right.
you can actually choose to simplify things, reduce your taxable rental income by up to, get this, a full 1,000 pounds.
Wait, hold on. So I could potentially shield a full 1,000 pounds of my rental income from taxes. That's a
Yeah,
pretty sweet deal, I mean.
it is.
But I'm sure it's not for everyone, is it?
You're right to be a bit skeptical. It wouldn't be that effective as a tax break if everyone and their neighbor qualified for it.
Right. Right.
And this is where things get a bit more specific, I guess.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, you have to be earning income from what's officially called a relevant property business.
Okay.
It sounds a little jargony, but just think of it this way. If you're making money by renting out some property you own,
Mm-hmm.
it probably counts as a relevant property business.
Probably. So there are exceptions to this whole relevant property thing.
Yeah, there are a couple of key ones to keep in mind.
Okay.
First off, if you qualify for what's known as rent-a-room relief, which, by the way, is a separate tax bike, for renting out a room in your main home, you wouldn't also be eligible for the property income allowance.
Okay.
So they're kind of like two separate paths.
Yeah.
And you got to choose which one suits you best, right?
Makes sense. No double dipping. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one exception. What's the other one?
The second one has to do with something the HMRC calls connected parties. So basically, if the rental income you're getting is coming from a business or some kind of entity that you have a direct connection to,
Okay.
then it might not qualify for the allowance.
Interesting.
Think about it like situations where you're renting to a company that you are a director of,
Right, right.
or to a business partner, or even, a close relative.
Mm-hmm.
In those cases, the HMRC really wants to make sure everything's above board.
Yeah.
So they have these separate rules in place to, I guess, prevent any funny business from happening.
Interesting. So if let's say I'm renting out a flat I own, let's say, in London,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably a relevant property business, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But what if, my brother, he needs a bit of extra storage space, pays me a small fee to use my shed.
Oh.
Would that get flagged? Just because, he's family.
Those are really good questions, and that's exactly the kind of nuance that this allowance brings up.
Okay.
So let's break down those two scenarios you just gave me, starting with yours. So that London flat you mentioned, renting that out, that seems like a pretty clear-cut case of a relevant property business.
Okay.
No red flags jumping out there, so you'd likely be in the clear to use the allowance.
Okay, cool.
Now, renting the shed to your brother, yeah, that's where those connected party rules, they might actually come into play.
Ah, okay. So even small scale stuff, like within a family, it can still get kind of tripped up by those rules.
Exactly. It's not always about the amount of money changing hands,
Right.
It's more about the relationship between the people involved.
Okay.
And the HMRC actually provides a really good example in the manual to illustrate this.
Okay.
They talk about this guy, VJ, who rented out his driveway.
Mm-hmm.
Simple enough.
Right. Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward.
To a law firm. But here's the thing.
Okay.
VJ's daughter
Oh.
just happened to be a partner at that same law firm.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of that connection, because they were related, VJ's rental income, well, HMRC said it was ineligible for the property income allowance.
Interesting.
Yeah, it really highlights how it's those little details, those relationships that can be super important when you're trying to figure out if you're actually eligible or not.
Okay. Yeah, this is really interesting to see how it's not just as simple as, oh, I own a property, I'm renting it out. There's all these little details.
Exactly.
So let's assume for a second my rental situation, it does line up with all this criteria.
Right.
How does this allowance actually work? Is it always a flat and £1,000 being deducted, or does it change depending on how much I'm actually making from the rental?
Great question. And the good news is there's some built-in flexibility. You get to choose how you want to use it.
Okay, nice.
There are two main ways you can benefit, which the HMRC, they like to call them full relief and partial relief. So let's start with full relief because that's the simplest one. Basically, if your total relevant property income, and we're talking the entire tax year if it's £1,000 or less, you're golden.
Okay.
You get to enjoy that income completely tax-free. You don't even need to bother reporting it to HMRC.
Wow, that's amazing.
Unless, of course, you're already filing a tax return for some other reason.
Yeah, right, of course.
But still, pretty sweet deal for those who fall under that threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'd imagine most landlords are probably bringing in quite a bit more than £1,000, right?
Right.
What happens then?
That's where partial relief swoops in to save the day.
Okay.
So let's say you're earning, I don't know, more than that £1,000 from your rental property. You don't miss out entirely.
Okay, good.
You can still choose to deduct that full £1,000 allowance from your total rental income, which basically means you're reducing the amount that'll be taxed.
Right.
It's like getting a little discount on your tax bill, even if you're making more than that initial limit.
Right. So it's kind of it's like a sliding scale almost. Like you get the full benefit if you're under, and then it sort of scales down a little bit as your income goes up.
You got it.
Mm-hmm.
And HMRC, they give a really clear example of this with a woman named Stephanie.
Okay.
She rents out some space in her garden for events, makes about £900 a year doing that. But she also rents out her attic for storage, brings in an extra £300 annually.
Clever. Making the most of her space.
Yeah.
I like it. So, but she's over the £1,000 mark then, right?
Yeah, exactly. She's making, a total of £1,200 between those two income streams?
Right.
But because she qualifies for the property income allowance, she can still use it.
Okay.
In her case, she decided to go with partial relief, which means she can deduct that £1,000 allowance. Leaves her with only £200 that's actually subject to taxation.
Okay. That's fantastic. That makes it really clear to see how even if you've got a couple of different things going on, you can still benefit.
Mm.
What about those landlords that have a more complicated setup though? Let's say they own properties in the UK and overseas. How do they decide where that allowance gets applied? Can they even split it up like that? So someone with a flat in London and a villa in Spain, they can just decide where that £1,000 deduction goes.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about UK properties.
Yeah.
You can spread that deduction across your entire property portfolio.
Wow. Okay.
And the HMRC, they give a really helpful example with this woman, Niam. She rents out this cute little cabin in Switzerland.
Okay.
And a couple flats back in the UK. So her total income from all those properties, let's just say, for example, it comes out to £1,800 for the year.
Okay.
Now, Niam, she gets to decide how she wants to use that £1,000 allowance.
Right.
She could take the full £700 off her Swiss property income and then deduct the remaining £300 from her UK rentals. Or, she could do any other combination that works best for her, given her whole tax situation.
Wow, that's actually way more flexible than I would have thought. It seems like this allowance really lets you, tailor your approach to paying the least amount of tax possible.
Yeah.
But with all this talk about deductions, flexibility, it makes me wonder, are there times when, I don't know, maybe using this allowance isn't the best move? Why would someone not use this amazing tax break?
$1,000,000 question. Right. And it's easy to get caught up in the excitement, but don't forget, it's optional for a reason.
Right.
The HMRC actually points out a few scenarios in the manual where you might be better off sticking with the standard deduction method, where you subtract all those allowable expenses from your rental income.
Okay, yeah. So in what situations would it make more sense to stick with those standard deductions then?
One big one is if your property business is actually operating at a loss.
Okay.
Let's say you had a rough year. Maybe you had a ton of unexpected expenses, like some major repairs came up, or maybe your rental income took a nosedive. Mm-hmm. Well, manual talks about this landlord, Xavier.
Okay.
Poor guy experienced a hefty £4,000 loss from his UK property business one year.
Ouch.
Right. If he had opted for that property income allowance, he would have completely missed out on being able to carry forward those losses. to offset future profits later on.
Ah, that makes sense. Yeah. Like strategically using those losses so you get the
Mhm.
most out of it later on. Are there other situations where those standard deductions might be the smarter way to go?
100%. We got to talk about those capital allowances.
Yeah.
You can claim deductions for that wear and tear on your rental property.
Right, right. Like replacing stuff,
Yeah.
updating fixtures.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Things landlords have to do all the time.
Those can be lifesavers for sure.
Huge. But here's the catch. You can't claim those capital allowances for the same period that you use the property income allowance. It's
Yeah.
kind of a trade-off.
Yeah.
So you got to weigh your options.
Right.
What's going to be more beneficial right now? Is it that instant 1,000 pound reduction? Or would you be better off, claiming those capital allowances and stretching those deductions out over a longer period of time?
It's like playing chess with your taxes, isn't it?
Right.
Thinking so many steps ahead, so much to think about. This has been so insightful. It's amazing how what seemed simple at first is actually super complex. Before we wrap up, any final words of wisdom for our listeners, as they're trying to wrap their heads around this whole UK property income allowance?
Yeah, definitely. More than anything, just remember, being informed is key. This deep dive, it's given you a really solid starting point to understand the ins and outs of this allowance.
Right.
But keep in mind, every landlord's different. It's crucial to actually sit down, go through your rental income, check if you're even eligible, and weigh the pros and cons. Do you use the allowance or do you stick with the standard deductions?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be afraid to crunch some numbers, explore those different scenarios, and definitely, if you're unsure, reach out to a qualified tax advisor.
Yes.
They can help you make the best decision based on your specific circumstances. Well, on that note, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into this whole UK property income allowance. Thanks for joining us as we explored all the little details, the benefits, and, even some of the potential downsides of this tax break.